Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all. This is actually my first maths conference. Yeah, it's great to be a part of what is essentially some fantastic collaboration with some excellent teachers across the country and across the world. So I'm going to start with these two quotes. So I'll just give you the chance to have a little read of these, and then I'll kind of officially start. So have a little read of that, see what you think, whether you agree or disagree. And have a little read of this one from the man himself, Dylan William. So these two quotes I'm going to kind of look at a little bit more, and some of the ideas essentially are coming from these two quotes. One being, maybe we need to own up to a few home truths and say that maybe there are people out there better than ourselves. And starting from that point of view, we can gain a lot. And the second one is that maybe there is this more intelligent grading system out there that Dylan William alludes to. And hopefully what I'm going to try and share through this workshop is possibly there is. Maybe Ipsative is that more intelligent grading system, or certainly a blended approach. So my name's Andrew. Just a few kind of housekeeping bits and pieces. I know Josh has already mentioned that. So if you do have questions, then do pop them in the Q&A. I ran through this presentation yesterday, so it was just about 40 minutes. So we will have plenty of time to come to any questions if you've got any, and we can discuss those. So that's absolutely fine. My neighbour has decided to put up a fence next door, so apologies for any background noise if that becomes interfering for you. So I'm Andrew Woods. I've been teaching maths for 7 years. I started out with Teach First in the West Midlands and moved to Bristol. After that, moved into Key Stage 3 coordinator role, and then kind of moved across into another school in Bristol as a head of department, which was a fantastic school to be a part of. And then more recently, I've moved across to Kent and taken up a new position as the lead maths advisor for the education people, essentially with the aim of building collaboration across schools and supporting schools and supporting maths departments to be the best that they can be. So first of all, just a quick mathematician's apology, a G.H. Hardy moment for you, and just I hope you signed up with the idea that this is about assessment and that this is going to be looking at the assessment side of maths teaching. If you want some brilliant maths ideas, maths pedagogy, there's some fantastic workshops. I've just been listening into Philip's, which I found really, really insightful for some brilliant maths ideas. So the maths content is going to be a little bit light, so sorry to disappoint if that's what you're here for. I will try and itch that scratch, or scratch the itch once or twice, but this is really about assessment. So the aims of this session is firstly maybe to define what ipsative assessment is. I know that there might be varying levels of understanding of that. Look at some opportunities and constraints and what they might be for ipsative assessment, and lastly share some ideas, some principles, and these are guiding principles. The whole idea around ipsative is really to provide the questions and maybe to provoke people to think differently about assessment. So starting off with that first quote, there are people better than us at everything, including maths. And even Terry Tao, who was recognised with a Fields Medal in mathematics, thought as much as well. So just very, very quickly, let's look at the small gaps between primes. There's a famous conjecture called the twin prime conjecture, that there's infinitely many primes with a difference of 2. So 3, 5, 5, 7, and so on. And that there's infinitely many. However, to prove that conjecture has proved very difficult and kept busy some of the fantastic minds in mathematics for years. And what was very surprising was that actually there was a guy who worked in Subway and was a lecturer at New Hampshire University, was able to actually be the first person to put some sort of bound to this infinitely many primes. And his name was Ying Tang. He was able to bound it to 70 million. And he was able to show that there was infinitely many primes with a difference of less than 70 million. And this essentially started a bit of a race in terms of the mathematicians decided to jump onto Ying Tang's work and see if there was tweaks and improvements within the proof to bring that number down. And yes, Terry Tao was able to do that. He brought it down to 4,680. It did take him 160 pages of calculations. But Terry decided actually that, or Terence, was able to look at this and go, actually, if I collaborate, if I work with other mathematicians, maybe we can whittle this number down even further. So he set up a polymath project in which he decided to pose the problem out to many other mathematicians, and essentially a great competition, a great kind of collaboration took place. Where mathematicians were sharing their work and working together to bring that number down. And Maynard was able to share some further tweaks to the proof to get it down to 600. And again, that was further reduced to 246. And the number is fairly arbitrary, but in terms of getting that number smaller and smaller, it was a very attractive proposition for mathematicians because they could see their progress. They could witness their progress with their maths. And it has actually got down further. However, this is based on a conjecture and it has been proved with the Elliott-Halberstam conjecture that there's infinitely many primes with a difference of 6, which interestingly are called sexy primes. So this begs the question for me anyway, that if the real world of high-flying mathematicians is to work collaboratively and to support each other, and we see it with teachers, we work together, we support each other, and that's what today's about. It's learning from each other. Why is it then that in our education system do we pitch students against students? Why is it that we often put a student against a student in terms of their ranking in their achievements? So to try and facilitate this a little bit, I'm going to put you to the test. So if you do have a pen or a little bit of paper or something just to jot down a number, it's just a number. Want to test your short-term memory. We want to see how good it is, and it'd be nice if we could maybe rank everyone's answers, rank everybody's intelligence levels, and maybe we could share that with each other. We could highlight who won, who lost, who was in the middle, and identify that. We're not going to do that, but I did want to just draw some emotion out, draw some feelings out, and for some of you, just the thought of doing even a little test like this might have brought a little bit of fear, maybe a bit of excitement. Maybe you revel in that kind of idea of testing yourself, but that's not always true for everybody. Maybe it's apathy. Maybe you didn't care. I don't care about a test. I'm not going to involve myself. I'm busy making a cup of tea or popping to the loo. Maybe for some it was anxious. I don't like being tested. It's not what I'm in education for. Just bear those feelings in mind. That might have been what some of your students will be feeling every time we put a test in front of them. And sometimes that can be a really anxious time for a lot of students, normally because of what comes after, because of those judgments, because of those kind of stigmatisms about where they might fall within their peers. So we are going to do a little test, but do feel free to take those emotions away. You don't have to engage yourself with this, but I hope that you will. So this is just a short memory test. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. What I'd like you to do is just try and memorize as many of the items that are going to be on the screen, and you'll get the chance to recall those. So don't write anything down yet. You're just allowed to look at the screen and memorize. You've got 10 seconds. Take a big deep breath, clear your minds. Off you go. Okay, right. Hopefully you were able to take in some of those. Now, if you want to just spend a minute or two, just jot down as many of those items that you can recall now. So have a think. Really testing your short-term memory here. Your short-term memory is very limited. The average person can only recall about 7 or 8 items, and typically that only lasts about 15 seconds. Something to bear in mind in the classroom when you're displaying lots of information or expecting a lot from your students during a learning episode. Okay, just give you another couple of seconds. Okay, so have a little check. How many of those did you manage to recall? We're going to probably vary in terms of people's recall. I tested, so I've got twins who are 3. I gave them the opportunity to have a go at this, a collaborative effort. They did actually manage 4 items, but again, that's not what's important here. We're going to return to this later and look at how much progress we can make with this. Okay, so just maybe to bringing in a little dispute with an old friend of mine. So this item here, be interested to know what people call this. I would call this a seesaw, but I know maybe my northern friend would disagree and call it a teeter-totter, and we would have up and down arguments about that regularly. So the idea of this is just to create some sort of facilitation of ipsative assessment. We'll return to that later. So already I've alluded to the fact that education systems sometimes feel a little bit like this competition, this rostrum, in which we put students up at the top and we put students at the bottom. And what effect that might have on our learners and in fact the learning that they're doing. My background was in athletics. I did some athletics to quite a high level, and I would often feel like I'd failed if I didn't win a race. And that was and as much as my family and friends would maybe try and reassure me, it had been ingrained into me that athletics was about competition. And as I've grown a bit older, I've started to realize it's not just that. It's about doing our best and looking at how is it that we can recognize our achievements along the way. So really, this session is about ipsative assessment, and this is one of the, I like to think of it as it's a bit of an underdog in terms of the assessment world. Lots of us hear about summative and formative assessment, and in fact my introduction to ipsative assessment came in my teacher training. I remember very vividly sitting in that classroom, having a text in front of me, going through the definition of formative and summative and ipsative, and we stayed well away from ipsative. We mentioned it, we talked about it, but the focus was mainly on that formative and summative, and that was my first encounter with ipsative. And then a number of years later, about 4 years later, I started doing a master's in education and was looking at how schools had responded to assessment without levels. And it was very interesting. I was looking at 11 different schools across Bristol, and there was one school that had an assessment system that piqued my interest, and they were doing exactly this. They were attempting to identify a marker in which they could measure the progress that students were making and sharing that with the students. And it got me thinking and researching, and I stumbled across Gwyneth Hughes, and who's written a really interesting paper for higher education about how Ipsative could really affect the progress that people are making. And so I started to look at how this might be applicable to secondary schools. But again, I found that the research was thin and there wasn't much out there on it, but I did want to investigate further. So that's where my start with Ipsative assessment came. And if we just look at what Ipsative is, I appreciate we haven't properly defined this yet, and there will be various knowledge in terms of what this interpretation is. So this is a Freya model, just a really helpful model in which even in the maths classroom you can use to define keywords, terms, ideas. And so if we look at our definition there, Ipsative assessment is about the assessment of a current level of achievement, skill or knowledge or understanding is then assessed against their previous level, rather than a fixed criteria or norm. So an illustration is your results have showed you've improved by half a grade, or you've made this amount of progress, and the number part, we'll talk about that a little bit later, and that can be fairly arbitrary or it could be very calculated, but it's the focus on the progress. An example, again, I know some schools do this, some schools don't, but maybe they've taken 2 assessments, assessment point 1, assessment point 2, and the grade that they've then shared with the student is that they've moved up half a grade. Non-examples, you got a grade 5, explicitly comparing their performance against a criteria. So that's Ipsative. The word Ipsative, the etymology of it, ipsi comes from the Latin meaning of self. So it's that marker point of self. And we are comparing progress to one's previous attainment. For me, this sounded like a bit of a utopia in terms of the assessment world. And that's where it links with the Dylan William quote as potentially, how could this be part of a more intelligent grading system? I wonder whether this could prove to be effective. So another way just to help us think about what Ipsative is this really nice diagram. This diagram just highlights the fact that we can't move away from a criteria standard. They have to be in place. They are there. We have to, at some point, make those judgments against a criteria. But the question I'm asking is how is the best way to get there? So the journey along that journey to be measured on that criteria, is criteria referencing along that journey the best way to do it? Is norm referencing the best way to do it, comparing them against their peers within a cohort? Or is Ipsative comparing the progress that the student is making at each point? It's important to note that these are interpretations of data. So data itself, when we collect data, it's the interpretations, what we make of those data and how we share them is really important. Because it's an interpretation, we can therefore sometimes think about how we can design our assessment in a way in which it helps facilitate that. And that will come on to some of the ideas I'll share later about how we think about designing our assessment systems so that Ipsative can be part of the assessment system and what we share with students. So I would like to just quickly take an opportunity just to talk about learning, because the whole idea about reaching a criteria standard is that we are endeavoring to help our students learn. And we know that there's some fantastic research out there about some of the key principles of learning. So I just want to identify some of those, because it's this learning over time that we want to assess. We need to make sure we're clear on what we're measuring. So learning is that change in that long-term memory. Kirshner in 2016, really important that learning is something that we're measuring over a long period of time. Therefore, retrieval questions are going to be essential. We know that students forget things. We know that that drop-off is quick. And so we do have to build into our series of lessons and possibly our Ipsative assessment, that retrieval. Cumulative assessing of content helps. So keep revisiting previous content to assess that learning, and beware of the differences of performance versus learning. And this, I think, is really important. And this is where learning is a changing long term. It's really important to think about, not to be deceived, not to be misread or incorrectly thought of that a student has performed well in a lesson means that they've learned something. That might be the case, but often is not. We need to change the learning that's taken place into that long-term memory so that you can recall it a week, a month, a year later. And Ofsted's phrase for this really about how we measure progress, in fact, is all about, are the students knowing and remembering more? If that's the case, then they're learning. Okay, so because Ipsative assessment, it can be used across these things, and it has all of the functionality that can be used to make sure that we're assessing the right things. We can build an assessment system, making sure we're assessing that learning. So opportunities, and this is where I think Ipsative assessment, something that is not often talked about, and sometimes maybe we're not aware of these opportunities, and some of these are huge. Low retainers. Criteria reference assessments can have really negative effects on motivation, especially low achievers, who are sometimes led to believe that they're unable to learn. And this is from William in 1998. And no one wants their students in their classroom who feel like they're unable to learn. There's a barrier straight away there that needs to be overcome, which is going to be very, very challenging, despite all of the scaffolding, despite all of the kind of atomization, breaking up of the topic. If you're starting from a point where the student believes that they're unable to learn, you're going to meet resistance. And Ipsative then provides a way around that criteria reference assessment, avoiding those negative feelings. Coasting high attainers. Sometimes we just let those coasting high attainers go and just think, yeah, they're doing okay. They're going to meet their target grades, but actually, this is not under the new Ofsted framework, nor is it under the new Progress 8 measure, that we can't have anyone coasting. And sometimes revealing that to our coasting higher attainers is going to be really important. So, for example, it's been found that even in a graded environment, there's a greater chance, even with higher achievers, that students turn to cheating. And that's in Anderman and Murdoch's paper. That if we increase and reinforce a high stakes assessment culture, then we essentially sometimes push our high attainers to cheating because they feel like they need to maintain that top grade. So what about self-efficacy, their belief in themselves? Ipsative assessment, McIntyre shares, has a real strong correlation. The more we talk about their progress compared to themselves, the increase in their self-efficacy, their belief in their self. Intrinsic motivation, that motivation comes from within, the joy of learning. We can sometimes rob the students of that when we slap a grade on it and compare them to their peers. So again, improves formative feedback. We know formative feedback is one of the most effective ways for students to make progress, and by referencing students by their previous learning and their current learning, removes this idea of the feedback having a barrier because of a criteria reference grade. So William also points out that this demotivation that then creates a negative association with learning, and this really compounds the challenge. An overemphasis, and I'm not saying removal, an overemphasis on summative assessments and summative grades can lead to an overemphasis on learners being more focused on how they're doing and not focused on what they're doing. And if you do want to look at a little bit more, there is a really good website there, evidence-based education with Ipsative ideas. Okay, constraints, and this is the real stickler. This is where some of this utopian ideas, where all of our high attainers, lower attainers, and middle attainers start looking at their progress, and then why aren't we doing it? Why are we not doing it? And it is because of the constraints, and these constraints are difficult to overcome. So let me just point out a few of them. We rarely repeat the same cognitive test in maths. We don't often give our students the same assessment that they've just done 2 weeks ago. And therefore it's challenging to have those two comparative markers. It's not like running a race where you can constantly measure against a specific time, a specific distance. We don't often get a free rein in our assessment practice because whole school practice often does inform our department practice. And again, I'll talk about an idea later about maybe how could we get around that? How could we use both? Sorry, there's a fly flying around. This is a big one. Resistance from students, parents, leaders. Students want to know where they're going to fall on a criteria referenced system. So do the parents. How the number of conversations I've had at parents' evening where parents are so insistent on the grade that they're going to get and where they are on the grading scale, even in year 7 or 8. And there is a real resistance and a culture that, you know, is quite unhelpful. And reassuring the students and parents that actually it's in their best interest that we step away from those things and focus on the learning is a very difficult conversation. So I will share some ideas shortly about maybe how we can overcome some of these constraints. But essentially this might be my own little polymath project. If you have your own ideas or you've got some thoughts about some Ipsative ways of assessing, then do share those, because these are difficult to implement. And if you do have your own ideas, do share them with each other, please, or share them with me on Twitter, and then I can bring them together or share them more widely. So let's have a look at some ideas. So here's some 6 very basic principles about how we can adopt some Ipsative assessment within our departments and within our school. So first one is a very simple change, and it's just that interpretation. So is there a way in which we can change our summative judgments that might occur in your assessment calendar into more Ipsative judgments? Can that happen? For example, let's say term 1, term 2, you've done 2 cumulative assessments. So what I mean by that is content that is being learned in the past is still being assessed as time goes on, and more content has been learnt, so you're assessing more content, but you're still wanting to compare those 2 performances. So let's say we want to look at that jump there. How much progress has occurred with the increase of learning that's happened? And the number is arbitrary. You could use GCSE grades, you could use your working descriptors, percentages, and so on. Some sort of way in which you can identify the size of the gap. And I'll give you one idea in a minute about where that number could come from. That's good. We can see that. It's also bearing in mind Ipsative assessment could lead to a negative number. You know, we can find that students are not retaining the things that they've learned, and that might put up the red flags that some more intensive work might need to be done with that learner. Okay, next idea. Before and after. So maybe you do more kind of unit-based assessments, and I know that there's one school in Cornwall that does this. They pre-test and post-test, a before and after. Now that could be on a particular topic, question whether it's going to be learning over time, but you can do that, and we can look at the difference between those 2 assessments, or even within a lesson. you use your starter and your plenary, and you're comparing those two differences. How much learning has occurred? I do question, like I said, that learning is happening over a change in long-term memory, so that second assessment should be a little bit later. It should be delayed to really assess whether that's gone into their long-term learning. David Taylor's got his website is fantastic, increasingly more difficult questions. As part of his website as well, he's also got lots of GCSE questions where you can randomly generate different numbers and answers, enabling you to do that kind of same question, different numbers approach to really assess whether they've now, after say gone through the technique of answering that question, whether they can then reproduce and have a go at that, building confidence as well. Likewise with GCSE shadow papers, I know something that I was doing with my Year 11s was making sure that we spent time with exam questions, going through them. They might sit them in an assessment conditions. I might look at the question level analysis, identify a couple of those questions that were difficult for most, go through them, model them, and then provide those same questions back to see if they can replicate that. And again, we might come back to that same question with a different number 2 weeks later, and assessing, have they made that progress on that question or that assessment? Or you could just use your school assessment points as your before and after marker points and just simply compare those. Like I said, Ipsative assessment can be a light touch, or it can be a very heavy touch in terms of its implementation. Right, again, just a diagrammatic point here. Assessment 1, assessment 2, there's some sort of process in which feedback has occurred back to the learners. We're making that comparison between that second assessment and the first, before, after, and this process carries on. We keep going over to the next assessment, we compare, and we're feeding that back to the student. Okay, idea 3, Ipsative grading. So there's kind of 2 ideas in this one, idea 3 and 4. What we want to look at is when we've got 2 students who are on our GCSE scale at 2 ends of the spectrum. What we don't want to do is say to our one down at grade 1.5, say, and show him that this student up here is at 7.5, and essentially ask him to improve, you know, get from there to there, please. Here's the criteria, here's the things you need to learn, and making it obvious to the student that there are other students ahead of him. Not helpful. Instead, and it's the same with our high coasting attainers, we don't want any learner to think that they're okay just staying here. So get rid of the numbers, look at the scales, and focus simply on where they are and where they need to get to. Sorry, not where they need to get to, where the progress is going to be. So let's say it's our before and after assessment, and we've got our 2 students, they've moved up, which is brilliant. We're getting some positive Ipsative grading. And it's those grades there that are shared with the student to reinforce that self-efficacy, that motivation, the intrinsic motivation, and a greater focus on that than where they are on that GCSE grading stick could hold bags of potential for learners. Like I said, you're going to have resistance, and there are going to be those constraints with students and parents, but it's a matter of fighting that with the rationale that this is with their best interest. And I'm going to share 1 or 2 quotes later about why that's the case. Okay, so they could be based on their previous learning. So this could be percentages, it could be performance indicators, or it could be this unseen grading. And this again will be one of the ideas later on about actually, do we need to share those gradings with our students at every point, or are they just used for internal purposes, for school data tracking, for whatever purpose that your school wants to use them for? It's worth noting that demotivation does come about because our personalised feedback and the sharing of the grades do carry really powerful messages for learners about themselves. And it's worth bearing that in mind and not dishing out what grades students are on too easily, and actually recognizing that these students will have a real emotional reaction to what grade is shared, whether that's helpful or not. But having the idea that maybe this isn't going to be best for their learning, because it might distract them from their learning and focus them on the wrong thing. So a criteria reference system does often continue to be one of competition and motivation, and it can inhibit our feedback and our formative assessment as a result of. Next idea is one of my favorites, but like I said, with ipsative assessment, it's difficult to implement, but this is my favorite, and it's, oh, sorry, I'll just go back to that because I will make a point about this. Yeah, I'm very reluctant to mention this one, but as someone who is really hot on data and tracking and things like that, and I just wonder whether even the subjective nature could be used here. And it's something that does great against my very natural instincts, but I wonder whether actually the subjective nature of sharing an ipsative grade with a student might hold more long-term benefit than a more kind of rigorous data-driven ipsative grading. I'll leave that there. I'm not sure what I think about that yet, but there could be a place for that. This is my favorite one, but again, it's really tricky. Measure in months of progress. Maybe the ipsative grade could be this measure of months of progress. Now, the Education Endowment Foundation do this with their toolkit, and I think it's a fantastic way of identifying what's effective. And how they do that is they look at the effect sizes between two groups, and this is where the challenge is could there possibly be a comparable group in which we assess a student to, let's say, the expected amount of learning that occurs through a scheme of work, and if we're able to compare what they are doing and how much learning they are making to this control group, then we can look at this effect size, and it's that effect size that can then be translated into months of progress. And this is the table that the EEF use to convert the effect size, whether a student compared to a control group has been greater or less than, doesn't mean they've learned less, it just means they've learned less than the control group, into a months of progress. And I do wonder whether that holds some potential for ipsative grading, about being able to share with a student that you've made 2 months of learning in 1 month, could hold some bags of potential for motivation for our lower attaining students. Idea 5, the seen and the unseen. William, again, I've used a lot of what he's said, talked about that intelligent grading system. What might it be? And we can't get rid of summative judgments, like he said, and that we can't run away from a criteria reference assessment system. But I do wonder whether we can blend summative grades and ipsative grading so that it retains the role for a school, so that they achieve those markers to make those comparisons between cohorts, but also still have that criteria referenced in the background. And I just wonder whether, do we have to show students every time what grade they get? Can that be unseen? Can that be held within the department and as a teacher, and let the teacher hold that responsibility so that the focus for the learner is on the learning? Again, you're going to meet resistance, but is it in their best interests that we fight that resistance to share those grades and keep it unseen until the right time? And could regular ipsative assessments carry that ipsative grade to really focus the learners on the formative feedback instead? It's that frequency of the summative judgments that I think is worth reviewing, constantly, whether they are then helpful as marker points for our students. I know I've worked in schools where we've done summative judgments every half term, and I've gone to other schools where it's been a summative judgment every term, and so on. And maybe some schools out there, you know, have already adopted this and are reducing the number of summative assessments or summative grading that they do. But sometimes we don't want to get rid of that and not have the opportunity to measure progress and to visibly see how those students are doing. Last idea, ipsative feedback. So feedback being moving the learner forwards. If we can look at what that student has learned and move that learner based on what they've learned forward, then that feedback is going to be really, really powerful. It's also known as personalized feedback. It's looking at the individual, it's looking at the learner and helping them move forward. So, for example, we've talked about ipsative grading, enabling progress to be monitored and not inhibited by the effectiveness of the formative feedback. So the ipsative grade doesn't then distract the learner as much as a criteria reference grade does. Just some ideas and practical ways that could look. So I know I've used things like pinpoints, enabling me to kind of create personalized booklets from a question level analysis of my year 11 papers, that they can then go away and look at those questions and look at the content that they've struggled with and to focus on them on the feedback part of it. Excel generated feedback sheets. So, you know, point out to the student, not what grade they got in an assessment, but point out to them, what is it that they need to go away and learn and focus on again, and give them those opportunities to repeat that. So dedicated improvement reflection time. So dirt tasks, time in lesson for them to re-engage with that content so that they can see their progress. And this is something that hopefully removes the overshadowing effect of grades from an assessment, and it does then weaken the formative benefits that sometimes we as teachers spend hours doing, you know, marking a set of books or marking a set of papers and putting on lots of corrections. And if we then put the grade on the front, more often or not, the students are going straight to that grade, straight to what grade they got and comparing it with their other students in the classroom, and not on what is it that they need to learn, what is it that they need to improve on. I mean, just one note, the school I worked in recently, we had an Ofsted under the new inspection framework, and it was very evident with the deep dive questioning that they weren't really interested in internal data. So we could chuck at them loads of figures and numbers and progress according to our criteria reference grading system that we had, but they weren't interested. They wanted to just know, are the students learning more? Are they knowing more, and are they remembering more over time? And do you have a system that reflects that? So it's really important to maybe focus our assessment systems not on a criteria reference system. There is a time and a place, and there is a point in which a learner does need to recognize where they fall on that grading system. But I do question whether that should be in, say, let's say Key Stage 3 or something along those lines, and that is going to meet resistance. So there's my 6 ideas. Like I said at the start, they are very generic, they're principle based, and they are very difficult to implement. And I would welcome ideas on maybe how people have done something like this in the past, and maybe we just didn't call it ipsative, that's all. I'm going to finish with 2 more things. One that I think is really important for us as in the teaching profession, a wider implication, that this same idea should also be recognised and implemented, I was listening to Craig Barton's, one of his podcasts with Dylan William again. Sorry, I'm a bit of a fan. And this came out as a quote, and I thought is brilliant. And this was regarding the teaching profession. He said, "I don't care how good you are. What did you want to get better at? And can we focus more on what it is that we need to improve, our areas of weakness, and things that we want to improve at, rather than putting us up against a scale?" And I think that would get us to that criteria reference point in a better position. Okay, so let's return now, and I'll have a look at the questions in a second. Let's return now to our images, and what I'm interested in is, so get rid of your drawings or pieces of paper. We're going to return to those images, objects, see how many of these you can recall again in 10 seconds. And what we're interested in, it's your Ipsative score. So we're interested in the difference. How many more have you been able to retain and improved on? So here we go, 10 seconds, off you go. Okay, have a little, make a little list. Let's see if you've got, oh, sorry. Make a list with your objects, sorry. I'll have a quick look at the Q&A, see if there's anything there that I can address now. If not, if I don't get the chance to address these now, then I will type a response. Yeah, so someone's identified the content, the amount of content covered in a short space of time. So A-level, yeah. Again, I think there's still a place in A-level teaching for cumulative assessing, and I think it's certainly important to be doing it. You might not do it as frequently, so you might want to cover 2 or 3 units and then look at a cumulative type assessment of all those 3, and then maybe 2 months later you might have covered another 2, and therefore look at all 5 units and attempt to not focus on assessment, a topic by topic assessment. I think there's still a place for that. I appreciate the demands on teaching time and lesson time, but I think there is still a place for cumulative assessing in A-level. I think that's still really important. And possibly, I'm just speaking from my own experience, we only used to do 3 of those a year. You could do them more than that, and I think there would be value in that. So we found parents and students found, yeah, and that's what I've seen as well. So someone's pointed out that raw score improvements was actually really helpful for parents to see the improvements that their students are making. I completely agree with that. Not to test by test percentage of experience. Yeah, so someone's pointed out, why could each test reflect their progress towards the whole? So for example, this might look like giving them a test for the content for the whole year in, say, October. Now, there's pros and cons to that. Yes, you would be able to give that visible progress, but I think you might find that more of a demotivating experience for some students, where they find themselves overwhelmed with the amount of content, certainly towards the start of that assessment process. It could be done. It would have to be very carefully thought through. How can we test new topics while still doing cumulative assessments without just doing assessments too frequently? I'm concerned about covering all of the necessary content. Yeah, and we talk about tests. Tests can take a whole host of different formats. So that could be a plenary. a short 3-question piece of paper at the end of a lesson. It could be an hour. It could be done in on a computer. It could be done as homework. So I think we've got to maybe think about testing, not taking the stereotypical view of sitting in a classroom for a set period of time. GCSE questions with different numbers. Does this not encourage memorizing an order of operations and not actually understanding of the problem? I think for a student to complete a question with a different number, they have had to engage with the process. And you're right, there may be students that memorize the order. But I think the process in which they've engaged with could still be helpful. Regarding comparing to a control group, is there a national data? Really good question. Is there national data to compare to? Now there is on the Key Stage 2 data, so SATs data you can look at, and you can get a real detailed picture across the whole country essentially, and look at the data. There are organisations out there that sell assessment packages that do provide that kind of data, but you do have to pay a bit of a premium for that. Otherwise, internal data, you can normally distribute historical data that you've had from previous years, certainly if some of those assessments are similar year on year. Right, I will come back to these questions in a second. Let's just jump back to some answers. So just double check. How many did you get? I'm interested in your Ipsative score. So whether you managed to get 5 last time, were you able to get 8? And that would be a +3. It's the Ipsative score that's important here. How much progress have you made in your short-term memory on this? I appreciate I've referenced a few things. Let's return now to those 2 quotes we started with. Can we let our students know the progress they're making compared to their own performance, their past performance? Let them know, and do we teach them that there are people better than them, even the ones at the top of your class. When they move out of school into a bigger college or a bigger university, there's always going to be someone out there who's better than them, and that can be difficult to swallow. And Dylan Williams' quote, I wonder whether there isn't a more intelligent grading system, and what part could Ipsative play with this more intelligent grading system? I do wonder whether it could answer some of those questions. Here's some of the references. I will leave them there if you want to kind of dig into those at all. But I appreciate I've got a few minutes to finish, so let's just have a go to the questions. If there's any more to address. Josh, I don't know if you had seen any that were really good questions to quickly pick up on. Oh, could you repeat DIRT again? Dedicated improvement reflection time. However, I've heard people refer to it as a different, how do you stop students from going through assessments and counting up marks, then comparing themselves with others? Yeah, really good question. You can't, I don't think we can hide away from the fact that maths is a right and wrong answer type work. And I don't think you can kind of hide from that. Whether you can be discreet in terms of sharing the work with the student and sharing their marks, some of that would be a culture shift, developing a culture that doesn't facilitate them comparing themselves to each other. And again, it's rife in primary school, secondary school, sorry. Students constantly want to know how they're doing compared to their friends. And yeah, that's a culture thing. And that's going to be a very difficult one to overcome. But I don't think you can kind of hide from it. Do you know if there are any countries who are already doing this successfully? Really good question. So I've been hunting around for Ipsative assessment for a couple of years now. No, so I've seen a little bit in, I think it was Canada, do a little bit of it. but it really is an underdog. Not many education systems use it as a method of assessing. I mean, Gwyneth Hughes, when she wrote her paper on it, she did get kind of critiqued on it quite heavily in the higher education world. But a lot of the critiques I read through those were specific to higher education and weren't relevant to secondary. So no, I haven't read any particular countries who do this successfully yet. Maybe we could lead on that as a country. If you were doing pre or post unit tests, how long would you recommend waiting after the initial teaching before the post test? Brilliant question. There's a really good, I think, research ed talk by Daisy Christodoulou. She does talk about it in an English context, but she talks about how often we should then do those post tests, and actually we should be doing them quite frequently, but giving them an opportunity to almost get to that point where they just start forgetting about it and then test them. And you know, that could be a lesson or two, it could be a week or two, but keep going back to that point where they're, and find that point where you find your students just starting to forget what they'd done that lesson, and that's the point in which you need to do that post test. So you don't want to leave it too long, because that's going to be demotivating for them, but you're going to have to find that balance with a class, really. Could tests take the format of a starter with interleaved topics? Brilliant idea. Yeah, could be a starter with interleaved topics. How might we ipsatively assess acquisition of skills? Yeah, rather than knowledge or memory. A lot of that is going to be coming down to the nitty-gritty written feedback that you as a teacher might report back to a student. So if you're looking at, trying to think of a nice skill, and this is where maybe subjectivity could come in. So problem solving skills, for example, you've looked at your class's work on a problem that you've set them, and you want to give feedback to a class about how they've engaged with that. That is maybe where the subjective nature might need to come in, and you might want to draw out specific things that you were impressed with students' work. What if we have kids who are stay at grade 9 and can never get a positive ipsative score? Really good question. We can always go beyond in some ways, and for those students, it's keeping them interested in learning. It's not about the grades then at that point. It's keeping their hunger alive with learning. So it's giving them the opportunity to engage with further learning, reading around the subject, disciplinary knowledge. So providing alternative work, extension work. You've got to keep that love of learning going. And in that respect, you could measure the engagement with that.